Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to Avi, who's in Israel. And thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Chartock, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks. In addition to serving as the central address of Jewish affairs, the Federation is responsible for the welfare of our Jewish community. We plan for philanthropic, social, cultural, and the educational advancement of the Jewish community here, nationally, and in Israel. We're very fortunate to have with us Avi Melamed. It's an honor to welcome back Avi, who spoke to our community back in the fall. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert, intelligent analyst, a former Israeli intelligence official, a senior Arab affairs advisor. He's the founder of Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspective, which is an apolitical, non-partisan, educational, and nonprofit institute. Avi is a frequent commentator on international media platforms such as Al Arabiya, BBC Arabic, and English Bloomberg, CBC, and Reuters. Additionally, he is a permanent contributor to USA Today. Avi is speaking to us live from Israel. Please join me in welcoming Avi Melamed back to the Jewish Federation of Reading.
Brian, hello from Israel. Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. As always, it's very good to be back together. It's been a while since we've been together, and now we come back in an interesting times in this region, in the region of this Middle East. Always, never a down moment, sort of speaking, when we talk about this region. In our presentation today, obviously, we are going to talk about the most dramatic development recently in the region, Iran-Israel war. With your permission, I would like to talk about it from an interesting or different perspectives, and this is what I call looking beyond the horizon. In my presentation tonight, I will try to cover a couple of aspects regarding that topic. I hope that you could see the slides changing. That's good. I will start with general framing and how did we get here, and then we'll talk about Israel's operational blueprint. Then we'll try to understand a little bit from the region, how is the region looking at the war, and then the concluding part, the current situation and looking ahead. My presentation is going to be about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. So as a framing, I would start with 1979, a very significant development in the region, the rise to power of the mullahs regime. Mullahs are the Shiite clergies. They are coming to power in Iran in 1979, actually hijacking, sort of speaking, an uprising, a popular uprising of the Iranian people against the monarchy back then, against the dynasty. And the mullah regime that came to power in Iran is a Shiite one. Shiites are a denomination within Islam. This is a minority of about 14-15%. And the Shiites, one of the major narratives of the Shiites is the narrative that talks about creating of what the Shiites call a Shiite imamate, meaning a global Islamic entity that is based upon Islamic Shiite denomination and translation of Islamic Shiite denomination. And the term imamate refers to something very significant in the Shiite terminology, and this is the term imam. Shiites emerged in the 7th century following a power struggle within Islam. Islam emerged in the 7th century, very quickly turning into a conquering empire. And very quickly, there was a power struggle regarding the question who is entitled to lead this Muslim caliphate, kingdom, if you wish. That power struggle resulted in the creation of the Shiites. Shiite meaning the political faction of Ali, the 4th caliph in Islam, the 4th king, and the Shiite major branch, which is known as the 12-ish one, argue that there has been a line of 12 spiritual and political leaders, starting with this Caliph Ali that was assassinated in the middle of the 7th century. And the Shiites argue that each and every one of those spiritual political leaders, rather known as imams in the Shiite terminology, are connected to a divine source of knowledge, and therefore their rule should be blindly obeyed. Hence, you understand now the term of the imamate, the Shiite imamate, this global Islamic entity that the people and mankind should be living according to that entity. The interesting thing about this mullah regime, the Shiite clergy's regime that came to power in 1979 and turning actually Iran into an Islamic Shiite theocracy, the interesting thing about that regime is that it actually took this vision that is rooted deeply in the Shiite belief and translated that into a geostrategic expansion policy across the Middle East that basically aimed to create what has been known by the name of the Shiite Crescent. Under this title of expanding or exporting the Islamic Shiite revolution, the mullah regime strived to create what we call the sphere of influence named the Shiite Crescent, particularly looking at areas of influence in the heart of the Arab world, where the Shiite regime was basically striving to create influence and dominance. Starting in Gaza Strip, offshore the Mediterranean Sea, going through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, and continuing to Africa. When you look at what happened in the last couple of decades since this regime came to power, you see that that regime was quite effectively enhancing its vision of this Shiite crescent. The major mechanism that the mullah regime has been very effectively developing and applying to achieve that goal was a sort of a triangle of deterrence, if you wish, a kind of a stool that has 3 legs, and each and every one of those legs basically serves this objective of creating this Shiite crescent or Iranian crescent. One leg of this tool is the nuclear program. The other one is the missiles and the drones project. And the third one is the proxy network, meaning a network of armies of terror that the mullah regime has been supporting, arming, guiding, nurturing in the last couple of decades. We are looking at names such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shiite militias, and others. This interesting mechanism, this triangle, this stool, had 2 major perspectives or objectives. One was that each and every one of the components of the legs of that stool basically act as a shelter that is deterring against any kind of attack or a threat on the other 2 components of this stool. And the second thing, which is very interesting, is that all in all together, coinciding as one, these 3 components, the nuclear program, the missiles and drones, and the proxies, together basically provided the mullah regime with an ultimate immunity, actually acting as the ultimate perfect deterrence mechanism. In other words, as far as the mullah regime is concerned, its strategy was, on the one hand, to expand its influence across the region while proactively, aggressively, violently taking more and more areas under its control, particularly at the expense of the Arab world, but at the same time remained totally immune and bear no ramification and repercussions for its aggression. That has been an ultimate perfect, almost perfect deterrence mechanism that the mullah regime very sophisticatedly has been able to develop in the last couple of decades. You know, history has a lot of irony. The beginning of the downfall of this triangle is connected to another event that I'm quite sure you are familiar with, and this is, of course, October 7 attack on Israel. October 7 attack on Israel launched by Hamas, a major component in this Iranian triangle, aimed to further deepen the influence and control of Iran in the region as part of its large vision. However, when you look at the consequences and the aftermath of October 7, you see, interesting enough, that by the end of this process, what happened was that this mechanism, this triangle of deterrence, basically was shattered. One major reason for that was the fact that during 2024, following October 7, as the war between Israel and Hamas expands and now includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel caused a significant damage to both Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah, the most powerful proxy of the Iranian regime, has been severely beaten and defeated. Hamas in Gaza Strip severely beaten, losing its control over Gaza Strip. In other words, during 2024, the Mullah regime is losing two major arms that are significant components of this triangle of deterrence. Not less significant is the fact that in 2024, for the first time, there is a direct military collision between Israel and Iran, twice, two episodes, in April and October 24. The aftermath of those two short episodes of exchange of slaps, sort of speaking, basically revealed that the Mullah regime is actually not totally immune, that its deterrence image is actually significantly fractured. That development during 2024 resulted in, among other things, a domino effect across the region that further weakened the grip of the Mullah regime across the region. And the most significant dramatic development was, of course, the downfall of Assad regime in Syria towards the end of 2024. Assad regime in Syria was one of the most significant cornerstones in the Iranian master plan of expansion. Assad regime in Syria was an enormously significant cornerstone in this whole structure of the Iranian Shiite crescent. With the downfall of Assad regime, the Iranian hegemonic vision and strategic plan basically collapsed. Given that fact, by the end of 24 and beginning of 25, that the Iranian strategy of expansion has collapsed, coupled with the increasing challenges domestically in Iran, economically, socially, environmentally, politically, boosted with the rough sanctions imposed on the Iranian regime by Trump administration, the combination of these factors basically resulted in a unique, unprecedented, and maybe irrevocable window of opportunity to try and to proactively address the biggest challenge the Mullah regime presents to the region, to Israel, and to the world, and this is the Iranian regime nuclear program. That moment, that combination, that conjunction of circumstances and development basically underlined Israeli government decision to launch a war against Iran in June 13th. What has been Israel's operational blueprint in this war? When you look at the blueprint of that war from an Israeli perspective, you find some very interesting components, and most significantly, you are looking at a blueprint that was very, very profoundly, meticulously speaking, sought and tailored to act in a very synchronized way to basically ensure as much as possible maximum immediate impact. During the night between June 12th and 13th, between Thursday and Friday night, Israel launched the war, and one of the first things that Israel is doing is to target two major human assets of the mullah regime. One is the leadership, the senior leadership of the two major military pillars of the regime. One is the Iranian army, and the other one is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC. The other thing Israel is doing at the same time, parallel to that, is also targeting a group of scientists, rather known as the armament group. These are the essential core of knowledge that their major mission was, in the end of the day, to transfer the nuclear accumulating capacities of the regime into weaponizing that into a nuclear military capacities. Israel is first and foremost targeting those two major critical elements, and by doing that, Israel, in a first blow, crippling significantly both the chain of command of the Iranian mullah regime, and at the same time also significantly damaging the core of professional knowledge, this group of armament group that is the core essential group of the Iranian nuclear military project. Parallel to that, Israel immediately strikes two major Iranian nuclear sites. One is the site in Natanz. The site in Natanz include dozens, thousands of centrifuges that basically are the quintessential component in the enriching of uranium. And the other site that Israel immediately strike is the nuclear site in Isfahan. The nuclear site in Isfahan has another significant role in the whole chain leading to the ability to produce nuclear military capacity, and that is by transforming the uranium from a liquid position into a solid one. By attacking those two sites immediately, Israel immediately crippled a significant component of the Iranian chain of nuclear military capacities. Parallel to that, Israeli Air Force is starting to attack Iran's ballistic and drones infrastructure. This is the major weapon that Iran basically was developing and basing its all deterrence capacities, meaning the ability to shoot thousands of ballistic missiles with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of explosives, the ability to send drones, attacking drones, sophisticated attacking drones. That ability was the pillar of the Iranian deterrence capacity. The Israeli Air Force is starting immediately the night between Thursday and Friday, June 12th and 13th, to attack that infrastructure. And the purpose here is, as much as possible, to erode, to eliminate the Iranian retaliation capacities. In fact, within 48 hours, Israeli Air Force commander announced that the Israeli Air Force obtained an aerial corridor and controls the sky of the western and center part of Iran. Parallel to that, as I mentioned before, Israel is continuing and expanding the attacks on these ballistic missiles depots and the infrastructure of the drones. When we talk about the ballistic missiles, there are two major components that we have to understand. One is the launchers. It is estimated that before the war, Iran has something like anywhere between 2,500 to 3,000 ballistic missiles and hundreds of launchers. The launchers are crucial because without launchers, the missiles are totally worthless. There is another significant component in this whole infrastructure, and this is the fueling process of the ballistic missiles. There are two major methods. One is liquid fueling, and the other one is solid fueling. The solid one is shorter in process, Hence, the missile and the launcher are less exposed to threat. However, the fueling process, the liquid one, is a longer process. It's about almost 1 hour, meaning that during that period of time, both the launcher and the missile are much more exposed to an aerial attacks. And so when Israel maintained and established an aerial control over the western and central sky of Iran, basically Israeli jets were able to target more and more ballistic missiles and launchers. Obviously, the more vulnerable one were the one that basically were going through the process of the liquid fueling of the ballistic missiles. So as Israel intensified its attack on different facilities, nuclear facilities in Iran, as Israel is intensifying the attacks on the Iranian ballistic and drones infrastructure, as I have explained before, now we got a very dramatic moment when the United States of America joins in, and the United States attack 3 major sites of the Iranian nuclear program. 2 are the Natanz and Isfahan that I mentioned before, and the third one, which is the most significant one, is the one in Fordo. We are looking at a nuclear site that has been built deep under a mountain, going deep hundreds of feet. And basically in the Fordo site was the final phase of enrichment of uranium, hence the reason why this site was so massively fortified under a mountain, under massive layers of concrete that were supposed to shelter the centrifuges. Around 1,000 centrifuges operating in this, according to the estimation, operating in this Fordo site. The outcome of the United States attack on the Fordo site, when the United States actually used its biggest weapon, conventional weapon, sort of speaking, meaning these massive bunker busters that basically penetrate the site, there has been some sort of like back and forth regarding to the outcome of that attack. There has been some sort of like different reports, analysis, some of them contradicting. It seems to me right now, all in all, when I'm looking at the whole picture and the whole different reports coming in from both Israeli and non-Israelis, intelligence agencies and other sources, it seems to me like that we could say quite decisively at this point that the attacks on Fordo, as well as the attacks on Natanz and Isfahan, and adding to that attacks on other nuclear affiliated sites in different parts of Iran, it seems to me like that at this moment we can consciously say that it seems like that the Iranian nuclear project has been significantly damaged. How is the region looking at this very dramatic 12 days war? How is the Arab world looking at that situation? It may not surprise you to know that on a governmental level, Arab government rushed to express 2 major notions. One was to condemn the Israeli attack on Iran, arguing that it is a violation of Iran's sovereignty. And the other thing, of course, was to urge all the sides to end the military standoff and to go back to the negotiations track. The public statement of the Arab governments across the region should be viewed in the context of the fact that the Arab world, and particularly we are looking at the neighbors of Iran, namely Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, to a lesser extent Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, they have suffered enormously the ramifications of the Iranian expansion program. Iraq Lebanon, Gaza Strip, Yemen, to a large extent became an Iranian satellites, either directly or indirectly controlled by the Iranians. The Iranian hegemonic vision inflicted an enormous death and destruction upon people of the region, and particularly the Arab nations. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have been attacked directly, militarily, both by Iran and its proxies, particularly the Houthis in Yemen. In other words, the Arab world, petrified, paralyzed, terrorized by the mullah's regime, rushed obviously to make clear to the mullah regime that it is not part of the attack on Iran. It is a neutral side. This is the governmental level. However, when you look at the discussion in the public realm in the Arab world, you could come across a couple of interesting perspectives that I think are reflected in these different cartoons that I'm sharing with you right now. So if you start from the right-hand side, you see the Star of David, and that cartoon reflects one sentiment in the Arab world. This is a sentiment that reflects or expresses joy with the fact that the Iranians were shooting missiles at Israel, causing some damage, in some places significant damage, and causing casualties. 29 Israelis have been killed as an outcome of the Iranian missiles attacks on Israel. Hundreds were injured. There was a lot of damage caused to Israeli urban centers. And so for segment in the Arab world, this is a reason for joy. And some basically took it to the place, basically saying, well, here is yet another stage of the disintegration of this Zionist entity. What you see right here in front of you, this Star of David that is torn apart, made by an Egyptian cartoonist, Mustafa Sayed. And actually, you can understand that this is something that reflects that sentiment in the Arab world. By the way, if you look closer, you could see that there are very strong, I would say, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, Nazi-style propaganda. You could see the rats that basically, of course, represents allegedly the Israelis hiding in shelters because of the Iranian regime attacks. However, in the center, you see another interesting cartoon. This cartoon in the center reflects what I think is the most significant perspective of the discussion in the Arab world. You see in the front two figures representing Arabs. One basically says support Israel, the other one says support Iran. And in the background, you see, of course, Israel and Iran that are struggling. That cartoon actually reflects the two polar, sort of speaking, the bipolar perspectives in the Arab world. In other words, remember what we said earlier, that the Arab world suffered enormously because of the Iranian hegemonic vision. Iran inflicted death and destruction across the Arab world, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza Strip. So as you can understand, many people in the Arab world loathe and hate the Iranian regime. They know that the Iranian regime has been the major source of a threat and intimidation and misery to the Arab world. Hence, you see right here that there has been a debate within the Arab world whether they should stand by Israel, because Israel is now punching this regime. For the first time, this regime is paying dearly for its atrocities, or should you side with Iran? Because in the end of the day, according to that perspective, Israel is the ultimate enemy, not the Iranians. Later on, towards the end of my briefing, we will explore that specific component and we'll see the irony, the bitter irony involved. And then to the left-hand side, you see something very interesting, which reflects across the board commentary and analysis by Arab commentators and analysts. And that basically, you could see very clearly, the Israeli Air Force is ruling not only the sky of Iran, it is ruling the sky of the region of the Middle East, actually positioning Israel as the leading superpower in the region, including military nuclear capacities. That sentiment has to be viewed in the sense that, once again, the Mullah regime up until recently has been viewed by the region as non-defeatable, untouchable. It enjoyed what seemingly was an ultimate deterrence capacities. Moreover, the Mullah regime constantly marketed itself as a mighty power. Endless parades, military parades, endless announcements and reports about new kind of missiles, new kind of submarine, new kinds of space capacities, new kinds of different weapons. In other words, all those years, the Mullah regime not only built itself an enormous deterrence capacities, but it was also reflecting a very powerful image of a mighty power that cannot be touched. What happened in a 12-days war, when Israel within 48 hours dominated the Iranian skies, when Israeli Air Force was freely flying over Iran, targeting at will Iranian military and strategic targets, the deep infiltration of Israeli intelligence resulting in the elimination of the senior commander of the Iranian military power, the elimination of the scientists, all those things together basically reflected an image of a humiliating defeat of the Mullah regime. Hence, you can understand the Arab commentators, Arab analysts are standing at awe and shock to see what happened within 12 days. So, if we're trying to look a little bit beyond the horizon, what could be potentially the ramifications of this 12 days war? Roughly speaking, there are two major issues to discuss. One is the question, will the war result in the downfall of the Iranian regime? In that regards, there are two opposing perspectives. One perspective says that counterintuitively, the people in Iran, though most of them loathe and resent that regime, the people in Iran, because of the war, because of the humiliating defeat of the regime, because of the damage caused to the regime, because of the fact that hundreds of thousands of Iranians had to flee from Tehran, the capital of Iran, that will actually bring people in Iran around the regime, to support the regime. However, there is a different perspective that argues that the agonizing, humiliating defeat of the regime is going to accelerate already existing challenges the regime is facing and basically deepening cracks that already exist within the regime's structure. For example, it is estimated that it's going to intensify the already existing power struggle within the regime regarding this question of the successor of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Prior to the war, already there has been accumulating information indicating that there is a brewing power struggle regarding that question, let alone following the war. And actually, today there has been reports published that there is already manifestation of this growing power struggle. The aftershock of the waves of the humiliating defeat are basically expected, for example, to further fuel sentiment of resentment and hatred of many of the Iranians towards that regime. Remember, this is a brutal, oppressive regime that has been brutally oppressing its people for decades. That joins into an accumulating huge challenges inside Iran, economically, socially, environmentally. That all things together could maybe result in a process or dynamic that could reignite sentiments of uprising that have been bursting from time to time in Iran. We all remember the 2019 and the 2021 uprising of people in Iran that has been brutally oppressed. In other words, that camp that basically speaks about the prospects of the downfall of the regime, that camp basically brings all those components and indicates, or as an indicator, potential indicators, that maybe the aftershock of the wave, aftershock wave of the humiliating defeat of the regime could result in dynamic that present an increasing challenge to the endurance and survival of that regime. At this point, it is an open question. Obviously, nobody has a clear, decisive answer. I would say that history teaches us that human situation is dynamic. And particularly when you're looking at episodes in the history, roughly speaking, similar to that episode, you will find more than once that in the end of the day, eruption is almost inevitable. For example, we can remind ourselves the story of the downfall of the Soviet Union, a downfall that actually started with this moment when the Berlin Wall was knocked down, and it actually triggered a dynamic that was unstoppable, resulting in the downfall of the Soviet Empire. Are we witnessing, or we are going to witness something similar in Iran? Maybe. Obviously, time will give us the answers. And then there is another significant aspect to explore, and that is the understanding that what we are witnessing right now is a very significant window of opportunity, a path that potentially could lead towards a new chapter of the region, ending the chapter of the Iranian dominancy that basically inflicted an enormous instability, violence, and destruction and death, and entering maybe a chapter of stability. But it comes with a question mark. The question mark goes particularly to one critical component, and that is the question, what is going to be, in the end of the day, the outcome of the expected negotiations between the Western powers led by the United States and Trump administration with the mullah's regime vis-a-vis the issue of their nuclear project, their missile program, and their expansion program in the region. Assuming that the outcome of that negotiation is going to be an agreement that indeed will meet the demands that were clearly set by Trump administration, and assuming that those demands are going to fulfilled on the ground, and there will be a very robust, vigorous mechanism that enforce that agreement on the ground, assuming that that will be the outcome of this war, then I think that we could look much more optimistically at a scenario of possible stabilization of the region. There could be a couple of manifestations of such process. One, the strengthening of the alliance of stability, boosting normalization, meaning bringing now together those components, major Arab states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and others. Some of them already have peace agreement with Israel. Some of them are engaged in a dialogue with Israel, and basically strengthening that alliance, that frame that could substantially contribute to building stability in the region after many decades of instability. Another thing that we could expect in such environment is the weakening of semi-state factors and actors, particularly those semi-state actors that have been part of this Iranian proxy system, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Iraqi Shiite militias. The weakening of those factors, semi-state factors, that have been actually acting as a Trojan horse within their own homelands, eroding and weakening the sovereignty of the states. If those semi-state factors are going to be further weakened because of this whole process, that is a good news, because it means that states could re-establish their sovereignty. This is a process that could coincide with already a process that is taking place within Arab politics, Arab public realm, and that is the growing understanding that in the end of the day, if you got a situation where you have a state with a government and political parties and armed forces, but at the same time, political parties are keeping their own military capacities independently, this is a recipe for a disaster. Hence, there is a growing, clearly expressed notion across the region in Arab states that basically said, if a state wants a future, it must insist that the state and the state alone has the right and the authority to keep weapons. The state and the state alone is the one responsible for decision of war or peace, not semi-state actors. Obviously, if that will be the trajectory, and there are some indicators that it is taking place, obviously this is a positive development and a good news. That environment could result in an interesting development, for example, diffusing of tensions or controversies between Israel and some of its neighboring countries, namely Lebanon and Syria. That potentially could bring in some sort of like scaffoldings that could be the platform upon which the next phase of natural relationship between Israel and its neighbor could be formed. Not less significant is the fact that with the weakening of the Iranian influence, with the downfall of its expansion strategy, with the weakening of the semi-state factors, parallel to that, we could see the further strengthening of Arab major players, this frame of alliance of stability that now could and should play much more proactive role in the context of shaping the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Up until now, for the last couple of decades, it was Iran and its proxies that dictated the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the trajectory was one: further severe escalation, because it is the interest of the mullah's regime and its proxies to further fuel the flames of the conflict. That explains the fact that during that period of time, major Arab players that could play a much more positive role in shaping the trajectory of the conflict, they basically, to a large extent, remained on the sidelines because they knew that the Iranians and their proxies are the one making the call. And finally, one last observation before we head towards our Q&As. You know, the Middle East politics is very convoluted and has a lot of paradoxes and irony. I want to share with you what I think is maybe the biggest irony of them all. One of the major reasons that the mullah regime was so successfully entrenching itself deep into Arab states, to the point it basically ruled Arab states, like Lebanon, like Syria, like Iraq, Gaza Strip. One of the major reasons, or one of the major mechanisms that enabled the mullah regime to achieve that, was the fact that the mullah regime market itself to the Arab world as the one that will liberate Palestine and support the Palestinians. And that has been done under the banner or the slogan of the resistance, a code word that actually means the elimination of the state of Israel. The Arab world was cheering and applauding that because it's a very powerful, emotionally, politically, culturally, a slogan that appeals to masses in the Arab world. However, in course of time, the Arab world realized more and that the Mullah regime is actually using that slogan of resistance as a camouflage to take over the Arab world itself. So there has been a growing understanding within the Arab world that they are basically tricked and misled by the Mullah regime. However, the Arab world, too weak, too petrified and terrorized and disintegrated, basically could not confront the Mullah regime expansion blueprint. To a large extent, the Arab world de facto came to terms with the expansion of the Mullah's regime. Parallel to that, what became more and more prominent in the discussion in the Arab world was the fleeing towards the rhetoric, and particularly towards the rhetoric identifying Israel as the major threat to the Arab nations. In other words, while the Arab world knew very well that it is the Mullah regime that actually smashing, destroying, shattering Arab states, in the Arab world, they choose, out of their inability to confront the Mullah regime, they choose to stick to the rhetoric that condemn Israel, portray Israel as the major source of threat to the Arab world. Ironically, very ironically, it is the state of Israel, through sacrificing its soldiers and civilians and sustaining an enormous damages, it is the state of Israel that actually offered the Arab world the ability to get free of the Iranian grip. This, in my view, is the biggest irony of them all that should not be ignored. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation and opening this session to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Avi. What we'd like to do now is take some questions. If you would, a few people have submitted questions in advance. For those that are on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer them, time dependent. But first, I'd like to thank Avi Melamed for his fascinating historical and contemporary understanding of the information and his unique insights as to this conflict. So, Avi, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, one of the questions in the Q&A is simply, what's next in Gaza? For example, negotiation or conflict? How do you think that the Arab nations will be willing to make peace while Israel is still engaged in a war with Gaza?
Thank you for the question. I'll try to do it concise and short so we'll have more time for other questions. I think that there is a good chance now to move forward, hopefully, in the context of towards the concluding and ending the war in Gaza. I hope that that will be the scenario. I hope that we could see our brothers and sisters that are hostages in Gaza Strip, that were kidnapped to Gaza Strip back in Israel, At the same time, I do hope and want to see the people of Gaza opening a new chapter, hopefully to rehabilitate Gaza and to rehabilitate their life. I think in that regards, today there are some following the war, there are better chances to moving ahead. It takes some bold decisions and of course a proactive role of Arab states and international community. I do hope that the estimations that talk today about a better chance for real breakthrough in the context of Gaza, I do hope that these estimations are not baseless. I think that they present a real potential possibility.
Thank you, Avi. And as a follow-up, as we're speaking about Gaza, Avi, do you believe that a two-state solution will work if the Arab population itself is divided between West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza?
Look, the whole issue of two-state solution is totally irrelevant. It's not a political observation, it's a professional observation. I have been basically making that observation for many, many years. It's not about a game of blame. It's about really reading where the two people are, Israelis and Palestinians. The bottom line, prior to October 7, let alone following October 7, they are not in a place where they can really come to the table and go through this very painful process of concessions and compromises that is crucial if you want to really reach a settlement or an agreement that is going to be vibrant and that is going to continue and not going to collapse the next day. That said, once we can move this issue of two-state solution off the table for now, I think that today there is a better chance for a much more realistic approach that basically should be centered around two major issues. One, creating a scaffoldings that will basically enable Israelis and Palestinians in a graduate long-term process to have sets of arrangements in a very small baby steps from one place to another. And the other thing is what I call the regional envelope, because in any case, it is very clear that any kind of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement and progress must be done in a context of regional envelope and of course supported and backed by international community. Today, I think that because of this dramatic outcome that I was talking about, the downfall of the Iranian strategy, the decreasing influence of the Iranians and their ability to continue and to dictate the agenda as they have been doing so far, I think today we have a better chance to move towards this mechanism of this envelope that will be able to start helping the sides building the scaffoldings in that process. We are looking at a very long, convoluted process. It should be clear it's not about, magic wand that overnight things are going to be solved.
Thank you. The next question is more global in scope. What do you see as the effect, if any, on Russia in light of the destruction of Iran's drone factories and missile production capabilities, and by extension, on the Ukraine war? I don't know if there's a connection there, but that's the question.
Yes, there is a strong connection. Iran provided Russia with missiles capacities, with drones capacities during this 4 years war with Ukraine. And obviously now with the damage caused to the Iranian infrastructure, as I was presenting, one could expect that their ability to continue and to support the Russians in the war with Ukraine, that ability is not the same as it was before the 12 days war with Israel. So one could naturally expect an impact of that fact on the trajectory of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Yet again, we have, of course, to see how things will evolve and develop.
Thank you. Let's turn for a moment to a domestic. politics within Israel. One of the questions, if the Israeli public supports Netanyahu after this most recent fight with Iran, could that possibly enable Netanyahu to become even more independent of the very right-wing pro-settlement proponents?
Well, some analysts argue that maybe given those circumstances, Netanyahu will feel more free to make some actions that he was clearly not willing to do because of the dominancy of the ultranational right wing in his government. His government, in the end of the day, was hanged by a thread because it was dependent and is dependent by the support of the ultranational right wing. And it was very clear that the ultranational right wing has been dictating to a large extent the policy of the government and Mr. Netanyahu's moves. There is one perspective that argues that maybe now Netanyahu will feel more free in a way to make much more bold moves towards the story of the war in Gaza Strip. But however, there is another camp that argues that Netanyahu, as much as possible, will try to drag on and continue to hang in power, particularly because he's concerned with the whole charges that he's facing and the possible indictment in the end of the charges in Israeli courts that Netanyahu is facing. These are the two major components. I think that, roughly speaking, one way or another, when I'm trying to look at the possible structure of the upcoming Israeli government, either it's going to take place when there is going to be elections before the date or in date, which is November 26th. I think that we could expect, particularly, I would say, we will not see anymore the ultranational right wing, in my perspective, in my analysis, in the next government, the ultranational right wing will not have a foothold in the Israeli government. I would expect that the next Israeli government will be back centered around what I call this core hybrid pragmatic Zionist camp, which is in the end of the day the spine, economically, socially, politically, militarily, you just name it, of Israeli society. And so I think that that would be, I think, the major outcome of these whole turbulent years and polarization and dramatic events that we have experiencing in the last couple of years. Once again, it may happen before the formal term of the elections that is supposed to take place next November. If there is going to be a process leading to an earlier elections, one way or another, I think that will be the outcome of that elections.
Thank you, Avi. Let me ask you a question about the role of the West. And when we say the West, Avi, we're referring to, in this case, the United States of America and Europe. So what should be, or what could be, the role of the West in this continuing conflict with the hopes of a resolution to the problems?
I guess you're referring to the Israeli-Palestinian, or?
Well, it doesn't make it clear, but I would like, since it's not on here, I would like to think more globally with Israel and all of its Arab neighbors and Iran.
Well, I think that there is a major lesson that we can take from here, which I don't think will be surprising. I mean, it's not a secret that the way that the West handled so far the Iranian challenge was far from being effective, in the sense that it's quite clear that the West chosen to a large extent to avoid decisively confronting the Iranian aggression. Obviously, there are different justifications or arguments that could support the Western position. But I think that in the end of the day, all in all, when you look at the whole components and the whole aspects of this long story, because we should remind ourselves the Iranian aggression is not something that started yesterday. This is something that has been going for a couple of decades. And when, all in all, when you look at the way that the Western powers handled that challenge, you find that there has been a very painful gap between the understanding of the West, as it was clearly expressed, that the Iranian regime is presenting a significant threat, and the fact that the West, in the end of the day, failed to effectively restrain the Iranian regime aggression. Some people would even argue that the Western policy fueled and boosted the Iranian aggression. I think it goes back to something that is maybe some kind of like a global lesson, sort of speaking, and that is the fact that, you know, when you are countering a real threat and you understand clearly that this is a threat that has to be addressed, you have to address that threat in a very non-compromising way, because threat has a very interesting feature. If it's not addressed, it's continuing to grow. It's not shrinking. And I think that this is one of the major things that has to be taken. I think among many other things, this is also a moment of dramatic, I would say, change in the context of the guiding concepts and mindset that basically up until recently were guiding Western policy. It will be, I think, interesting to see what's going to be the ramifications of that in the context of the upcoming foreign policy of Western powers vis-a-vis not only the Middle East, but also other parts of the globe.
Thank you. We'll take just a couple of more questions. And I want to thank our participants for their insightful questions as well. So, question I have here, Avi, has to do with the United Nations and the role that they do play or should play in these most recent conflicts. Specifically, the refugee camps in Gaza and the West Bank, if they're supported by the UN, which is in turn dominated by the Islamic bloc, how best to maneuver the UN out of the equation in order to solve a unification on a two-state solution with the Palestinians?
Well, as we all know, the UN stage presents a significant challenge in many different aspects. One aspect is we are all, of course, aware of the fact that unfortunately the UN became a stage for a robust anti-Israel, policy and statements to the point it has become almost distorted when you see, nations that are known to be a major terror sponsor acting as the chairman of the Human Rights Committees of the United Nations. This is one aspect of the very challenging aspect of the United Nations, which up at least now, unfortunately, has not significantly changed. There is another significant aspect of the United Nations, which again presents challenge. And that is the fact that when you look at the United Nations Security Council's resolutions, you find out that those resolutions have not been met or fulfilled. In other words, you're looking at a mechanism that is in fact toothless. That was clearly expressed, for example, in the context of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, in the context of the Houthis in Yemen, and other examples. In other words, even Security Council resolutions that basically are supposed to address clear challenges and threats, those Security Council resolutions basically just remained a dead word on a paper. And so these are a couple of examples of, I would say, the very limited, capacities of the United Nations, and hence should be very limited expectations of the United Nations to be really able to play a proactive, constructive role in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is, however, possible that if we are entering this new chapter, as I indicated as a possibility, We may witness some change in the United Nations policy vis-a-vis this whole story of the conflict, but up until now, in a factual based, there is no good reasons to be impressed by United Nations ability to effectively, constructively impact the trajectory of the conflict.
Thank you. I see. What I'd like to do now, please, even if the Q&A with Avi ends, we are happy to take your questions, and if there's an opportunity to send them to Avi, we'll do our best. Let me close with a question, Avi. The word tikva, the word hope, is really a word that's embedded in the fabric of Israeli society and culture. So I ask you, as an Israeli, as an expert, is there a reason for hope that Israel will be able to continue along the path of peace with its neighbors?
My answer for that will be short. The answer is yes.
Toda rabah. Thank you very much. Well, Avi, we are so delighted. We're so honored that you took the time to speak with our Jewish community in Reading today. And I'd like to thank those on the call, on the Zoom today, and those that came to the Federation office in person for continuing to show your support, not only for Judaism in the diaspora, but to our brothers and sisters in the state of Israel. And we want you, Avi, to know that we stand with you. We stand with Israel. And we, too, wish for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for, again, offering me the stage to hopefully educate. And definitely, I would say that it's a mutual feelings. You know, we are one. We are one fabric with many colors and many patterns, but we are one fabric, and it's a great feeling. And again, I want to thank you all. And hopefully, you know, maybe we'll have the opportunity to get in person sometime soon, maybe in our next visit to North America, October, November.
Please. Thank you. Be safe. And thank you all for joining today. Have a safe day.
Shalom from Israel.
Shalom from America.
Bye-bye.